October 1944. The war in Europe had turned decisively against Germany. Along the Western Front in the Rhineland, German formations were collapsing under the weight of Allied artillery and air superiority. Among the captured were not only soldiers but also nurses, clerks and female auxiliaries of the Luftwaffe and Wehrmacht. Many of these women had worked as radio operators, typists and field medics attached to frontline units. When the American divisions pushed through the shattered defenses, these women were gathered with the wounded and processed as prisoners of war. For most of them, this was the moment they had feared since the beginning of the conflict. German propaganda had long warned that capture by the Allies meant humiliation or even abuse. As they were marched past destroyed villages and burned-out vehicles, they braced for the worst. The autumn air was cold, heavy with the scent of damp earth and smoke. The sound of distant artillery still echoed through the valleys as they trudged toward the temporary holding pens established by American military police. Their first experience of American control began in improvised field cages, barbed wire enclosures guarded by armed sentries, often near supply depots or airfields. The women were searched, their documents recorded, and their insignia catalogued. Many still wore the grey or field blue uniforms of auxiliary service, with the eagle and swastika insignia on their sleeves. American officers, adhering strictly to the Geneva Convention of 1929, ensured that even female prisoners were treated as non-combatants. They were offered water, medical attention, and blankets against the cold. A Red Cross representative who visited these enclosures later noted that the conditions, though basic, were already far better than what most German civilians experienced during the same period. The Americans provided standard rations, tinned meat, bread, and coffee, that shocked the captives. One former Luftwaffe clerk later told a post-war interviewer that she had not seen white bread since 1942 and could not believe the abundance of food available to her captors. From the collection points in France and Belgium, the prisoners were gradually moved to embarkation zones along the coast. Because Allied forces lacked sufficient facilities in Europe to hold the increasing number of prisoners, thousands were transported to the United States. The journey began with transfer trains, escorted by American military police. Each rail convoy carried hundreds of prisoners, including women, doctors, and administrative staff. Those who later described the trip recalled their astonishment at the comfort of the transport. Instead of cattle cars or open wagons, as they had expected, they were placed in enclosed Pullman cars or converted troop trains, furnished with seats, heating, and restrooms. "We could hardly believe it," one nurse recalled. "After so many nights in bomb shelters and cold trains, we were riding like civilians again." The Americans offered coffee, sandwiches, and occasionally chocolate during the stops, luxuries that had vanished in wartime Germany. Upon reaching Atlantic ports such as Le Havre or Cherbourg, the prisoners were assembled for transatlantic transport. They boarded Liberty ships under heavy guard. Though the holds were crowded, the captives were issued life vests, bedding, and regular meals. U.S. Army medical officers ensured vaccinations were up to date before embarkation. Aboard the ships, German women shared cramped quarters, but were astonished by the professionalism of the American crews. Some were seasick during the rough autumn crossing, yet still received medical attention and daily rations. Compared to their expectations, a dangerous and degrading voyage, the treatment felt unreal. After roughly 2 weeks at sea, the convoys arrived at East Coast ports such as Norfolk, Boston, and New York. There, the German prisoners disembarked under strict security and were processed by the Office of the Provost Marshal General. They were fingerprinted, issued identification numbers, and divided according to rank, gender, and medical condition. Female prisoners were relatively few, numbering in the low hundreds, and were therefore placed in designated compounds within larger camps or attached to hospital facilities where they could work as aides. Their new surroundings were a shock. The camps were vast, clean, and organized, built with wooden barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, and recreation areas. Each camp housed several thousand men, but small sections were reserved for women or mixed medical units. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive the same housing, clothing, and food as American soldiers of equivalent rank. As a result, German women prisoners ate standardized army rations, meat, vegetables, bread, and even dessert. Hot meals were served 3 times per day. When compared to the starvation conditions in Germany during late 1944, the difference was immense. In many parts of Germany, civilians were surviving on little more than potatoes and ersatz coffee, while fuel and medical supplies had nearly disappeared. Yet in the American camps, even the prisoners had access to clean water, working showers, and fresh laundry. The shock was not only physical, but psychological. "We were treated like human beings," one former Wehrmacht typist later wrote. "It felt almost shameful to eat so well while our families suffered under the bombs." Camp records and later oral histories confirm this sentiment repeatedly. The U.S. Army's own inspection reports mention that German prisoners often gained weight during their captivity. In one documented case, a soldier claimed to have increased from 128 pounds to 185 during 2 years in detention. Although female prisoners were fewer, their accounts echoed the same disbelief at the abundance and orderliness of American detention. In the evenings, when the compound lights glowed across the barracks and the hum of distant generators filled the air, the women gathered quietly to speak in German. They discussed rumors of the war, worried for relatives, and tried to make sense of their new reality. Surrounded by enemy guards, yet treated with dignity and even courtesy, they began to realize that their assumptions about the Americans, and perhaps about the world beyond Germany, had been wrong. What began as fear slowly turned into an uneasy respect. Their captors were disciplined, fair, and unrelentingly practical. For many of these women, that realization marked the first step in understanding how differently the war looked from the other side of the wire. By December 1944, many of the captured German women had been settled into permanent prisoner of war installations scattered across the central and southern United States. Most camps had been constructed to Army Corps of Engineers specifications. Identical rows of pine-board barracks arranged around parade grounds, supply huts, and mess halls. The barbed wire perimeters were guarded by watchtowers and armed sentries, but beyond the fences stretched open farmland, not the devastated cities they had left behind. Daily life inside these camps followed a strict military schedule. At dawn, a bugle signaled roll call. The prisoners lined up outside their barracks while American guards counted and recorded names. Breakfast followed in orderly rotation: oatmeal, bread, eggs, and coffee, served on metal trays. For many women, it was their first consistent hot meal in years. They compared it quietly to the watery soups and rationed bread of wartime Germany. The United States Army Mess Manual required a minimum of 3,000 calories per day for each prisoner, a figure that astonished the German medical staff among them. Work assignments were organized by the camp commandant in accordance with the Geneva Convention. Female prisoners were never sent to heavy labor details, but were instead used within the camp: clerical work, medical assistance, laundry, or kitchen duty. Some trained nurses were allowed to assist American medical personnel at nearby hospitals treating wounded Germans. The U.S. Army found this arrangement efficient. The women were skilled, disciplined, and familiar with German language patients. In return, they received small wages paid in camp coupons, redeemable at the post exchange. Conditions inside the infirmary were a study, in contrast to the field hospitals the women had left behind. The American wards were clean, brightly lit, and well stocked. Supplies that had been scarce in Germany, penicillin, morphine, bandages, were available in abundance. A captured Red Cross nurse later wrote in her diary that she had never seen such stores of medicine and could not understand how the Americans managed it while German hospitals went without. She described the paradox clearly. "We are the defeated, yet they are treating us with care and respect." The physical environment of the camps was equally striking. The barracks were heated by pot-bellied stoves during winter and fitted with screened windows for summer ventilation. Each woman was issued 2 uniforms, underclothing, blankets, and soap. Inspections were frequent. Cleanliness and discipline were enforced, but without cruelty. The Americans kept meticulous records: daily rations, medical checkups, work rosters, and permitted periodic visits by the International Committee of the Red Cross. Those reports, preserved in archives, described the camps as orderly, with adequate facilities for health and recreation. Recreation became an unexpected element of camp life. The U.S. Army encouraged sports and education as methods to maintain morale and prevent unrest. Female prisoners participated in English lessons taught by civilian volunteers, art classes, and even organized choir groups that performed German folk songs on Sundays. A few camps screened American newsreels or motion pictures. Others maintained libraries stocked with German-language books provided by the YMCA. One former Luftwaffe assistant later admitted that she first learned about democratic institutions from reading those books while in captivity. "It was strange," she said, "to study American law while wearing a German uniform behind wire. Contact with local civilians occurred in carefully controlled settings. Some women were assigned to agricultural or sewing details under supervision, where they interacted with American farm owners' families. Reports from Texas and Nebraska noted that many locals were surprised at how young and polite the German women were. Small acts of kindness, a cup of coffee, a shared newspaper, often left deep impressions. Yet fraternization beyond work duties was forbidden, and guards enforced the rules strictly. Despite the relative comfort, the psychological tension never disappeared. Letters home were censored, and news from Germany was grim. As Allied air raids intensified, the women worried constantly for their families. They learned of the bombing of Dresden, the encirclement on the Eastern Front, and the approaching Soviet advance. Within the camp, discussions turned somber. Some still clung to loyalty, others began to doubt everything they had been taught. American officers occasionally organized lectures about democracy and international law. The women attended silently, unsure whether to believe or resist. As spring approached in 1945, the American command maintained the same discipline and standards, even as victory seemed certain. Inspections recorded that German prisoners were in good health, many showing weight gain and improved condition. The difference was visible in their faces, less gaunt, more rested. For nurses and auxiliaries accustomed to exhaustion and scarcity, the American order felt alien. "It was like waking from a long illness," one wrote. "Every day we waited for punishment, but it never came." The guards themselves were mostly young conscripts, polite but firm. Many had little personal hatred for the Germans. They followed procedure, addressed prisoners by rank, and enforced regulations without abuse. In interviews decades later, former guards recalled that they sometimes forgot the women were enemies at all. "They looked like anyone's sisters," one American sergeant said. "Clean uniforms, hair tied back, always proper. You could tell they were soldiers too in their way." By the end of the war in May 1945, the atmosphere inside the camps shifted again. News of Germany's unconditional surrender reached the prisoners through loudspeakers and newspapers. Some women cried openly, others stood silent. The American guards treated the event with formality, not triumph. There was no celebration inside the wire. Instead, the prisoners were gathered and informed that they would remain in custody until repatriation could be arranged. The war was over, but captivity would continue for months. At night, under the electric perimeter lights, the camp seemed suspended between two worlds, neither war nor peace, neither freedom nor oppression. Many of the German women later described those months as the strangest of their lives. They were the defeated enemy, yet living in comfort unimaginable to their families back home. The contradiction would stay with them long after their release. By mid-1945, the war had turned decisively against Germany. The last of the female auxiliary troops, communications clerks, nurses, and administrative assistants, were being captured in clusters across the Western Front. The American command was unprepared for the numbers. Facilities originally built for male prisoners were hastily adapted to accommodate women. In Texas, Oklahoma, and Iowa, sections of existing camps were fenced off, housing small contingents of women, some of them Luftwaffe auxiliaries, others members of the Wehrmacht's Female Signals Corps, and a few civilians caught near frontline areas. The arrival process was methodical but humane. Prisoners were deloused, issued fresh uniforms, and given new bedding. One Red Cross inspector in 1945 recorded a comment from a German female prisoner who said, "I have never been treated as politely as this, not even by my own army." Many of these women had been raised on years of Nazi propaganda portraying the Americans as brutal and immoral. The reality, clean food, soap, and steady medical attention, felt almost disorienting. Letters written home, later preserved in archives in Munich and Kassel, revealed their surprise in subdued tones. One woman described being served white bread and jam for breakfast, something she had not seen in Germany since 1941. Another wrote that the American guards allowed them to listen to radio music on Sundays. "We even laughed," she noted, "and it felt wrong to laugh as a prisoner." American camp commanders were careful to follow the Geneva Convention guidelines strictly. Reports from the Office of the Provost Marshal General noted that female prisoners were kept separate from men, guarded by women whenever possible, and assigned light duties such as kitchen or clerical work. They were paid token wages in camp currency redeemable at the canteen, where they could buy toiletries or chocolate bars. Despite the orderliness, the psychological dissonance ran deep. Many women felt guilt at being treated better by their captors than by the Nazi regime they had served. One interrogation transcript from Camp Ruston recorded a nurse saying, "It is strange. Your enemy gives you milk and medicine, and our own government gave us lies." Over time, American officers used these humane conditions as a quiet weapon of re-education. Prisoners attended supervised discussions on democracy, watched newsreels about post-war reconstruction, and read German-language newspapers printed by U.S. military authorities. Though participation was voluntary, curiosity often overpowered skepticism. "If this is what defeat looks like," one auxiliary wrote, "then our leaders deceived us more than we ever knew." By late 1946, most of the female POWs were repatriated to a shattered Germany. Many returned with stories their countrymen refused to believe. They spoke of clean barracks, warm meals, and guards who said, "Please." Some were accused of exaggerating or even collaborating. Others remained silent for decades. In post-war interviews conducted by the German Federal Archives during the 1960s, recurring themes emerged: relief, disbelief, and confusion. "They were the enemy, but they treated us like people," said one former prisoner. "It made us question everything we thought we knew." These testimonies, though scattered, paint a picture rarely included in mainstream wartime narratives. Behind barbed wire in America, far from the ruins of Europe, thousands of German women encountered an unexpected paradox: captivity that felt safer than freedom had been. For them, defeat came not through violence but through kindness that exposed the moral collapse of the Reich they once served.